Hi and welcome. I'm Nelufar. This is Dear World Live, a brand new offering brought to you by Doha Debates. Each week, we will be tackling a different aspect of this new reality we are all living in through the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you for those of you who are watching and joining us, whether it's on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. You are all welcome to join us. This is the second of our shows that we're bringing to you. And this show, although we are all isolated wherever we are isolated together. And this show that we're focusing on this week is all about one very particular community across the world. This week, we are looking at the impact that the coronavirus is having on the refugee population around the world. Now, I just want to get through some of the stats, facts, and figures that you need to know before we get into this. So across the world, there are 25 million refugees on all four corners of the earth. There is no continent, no country that isn't affected by refugees and the need for people to move out of difficult situations. Half of those 25 million are children. Now, one person around the world is forced from their home every 2 seconds. Less time than it took for me to say that sentence. This is a fast-moving situation where vulnerable people are in need of resources right now. I just want to take a second to tell you my own personal story. I'm Afghan, and I was a refugee as a child for many, many years. I know what it's like to be displaced. I know what it's like when you can't go backwards and there's no way forward. So this is a subject and an issue very close to my heart, very close to my life and my experiences. And so for all of you watching, I just want to remind you that you can always send in your comments, your thoughts, any questions you have for the guests I'm about to introduce. We always love hearing from you. Tell me where you are. What are you doing today? And get involved in the conversation. Thank you guys for watching. Now, I want to bring in our two guests. Very, very honored and privileged to be joined by Filippo Grandi, who is the High Commissioner for Refugees at the United Nations, the head of the UN Refugee Agency. Thank you so much for joining us, Commissioner Grandi. And I've also got Jamilah Sherally. She's a doctor working in Moria refugee camp. That is the largest refugee camp in Greek on the island of Lesbos. Thank you, Dr. Jamilah. Thank you, Commissioner Grandi. And of course, we are joined by some of you, some of our friends of Dear World Live, Imad Ahmed and Shafiq Rahman. You guys are all the way in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar. And I'm so thrilled to have you. You're currently working and coming to us from the largest refugee settlement in the world, in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar. And both of you are actively working with refugee communities every day. And I should point out, the reason you're able to sit so close together and not socially distance is because you live together. So this is all fine. It's kosher. Yeah. Thank you all for joining me. I'm so glad to have you.
Thank you so much.
Right, let's crack on. Commissioner Grandi, I'm coming to you first. Today we had the breaking news from America, from the United States, where President Donald Trump has decided to ban all immigration, including those of refugees, into the United States. And he specifies the fact that he wants to protect people from the coronavirus and protect jobs in the United States. What do you make of this kind of unilateral action?
I would say that not only in the US, everywhere we have seen as a reaction to the pandemic, a closing down of borders. I mean, you know, normally I am never here in Geneva where our offices are. I'm traveling all the time. I haven't been traveling at all for the past 6 weeks. We're all grounded. And it is understandable that these measures are put in place because at the moment, the big priority is stop the pandemic from spreading even further. What we are telling states from the perspective of the organization that supports refugees, my organization, we're saying, let these measures be temporary. Once the pandemic is finished, go back to normal, because if the restrictions to seeking asylum, to moving to safer places, you mentioned it yourself about your own case, If these restrictions are not lifted, then at that point we have a serious human
So
rights
you in fact agree with President Donald Trump and the limitation he's placed?
Well, I don't know. These are very political debates. And he was talking about, I think, he was talking about immigration as a whole, not specifically about refugees. My message to the US, to any country, would be, let not the right to asylum, the possibility of refugees of crossing borders and seeking protection, refuge from persecution, from war, let this not become a victim of the coronavirus as well.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, actually. I imagine that at this precise moment in time, the need to protect your nation and to offer refuge for refugees is kind of grinding against each other, and we're seeing this play out in real life. I want to ask you another question. Your agency is arguably the global guardians of one of the world's biggest communities, the refugee communities, one of the world's most vulnerable communities. How would you describe the impact of the coronavirus right now and the effect it's having on the people you're in charge of caretaking?
One effect is the same for all of us. We are all exposed to a very serious health risk hazard, the virus. The virus doesn't make any distinction if you're a refugee or the High Commissioner or a doctor, or we've seen it, right? So that's a common risk that everybody faces. But what I think we have already seen impacting specifically refugees, migrants, and other vulnerable communities is the risk of losing jobs, losing very meager daily wages and incomes. Many, many millions of refugees depend on these incomes that the first ones to go when an economic crisis rises, and this is what we are observing, as we all know, as a result of the pandemic.
Sorry about that. I think there was just a technical issue there. Thank you so much, Professor Commissioner Grandi is what I should call you. I'd like to bring in Dr. Jamilah at this point. Dr. Jamilah, you've just come off of a shift working in Europe's largest refugee settlement. What has the coronavirus done to your day-to-day practice, to you trying to help these people?
Thank you, Nelufar. Can I, if you'll permit me, just give you an overview of my morning?
Yes.
Perhaps that will sketch for everybody watching a good idea of what the situation here is like. This morning coming into camp, what happens is that the first thing I saw really was a demonstration of about 200 people who had a very peaceful demonstration today, really protesting for their rights. This is something which has always been the case in Moria, but has been a new development recently as well. As you walk into camp, like you said, this is the largest refugee camp in Europe. It has been made for 3,000 people initially, but now houses a grand total of 22,000 people, which means that as you walk into camp, this typical Moria smell, as we call it, meets you, which is a combination of decaying rubbish and sewage. And as I walked into the camp this morning, you see a large crowd really collecting in front of our clinic. At the moment, we're able to, there's about 200 people that actually present themselves to our clinic on a daily basis. At the moment, we're only able to really see about 100 of these because of all the COVID-19 precautions that we're having to take.
What are the precautions, Dr. Jamilah? What can you do when you've got a camp that's overpopulated by several thousand?
I think when it comes to, we're doing all we can on the ground. There's the prevention, of course, that we're trying to ensure. So there's initiatives between both the medical NGOs and the non-medical NGOs to really work on prevention, such as installing hand washing points, really educating the communities on the effects of COVID. But there's really so much you can only do because the hashtag stay home just does not apply in such an overcrowded camp. And perhaps just to continue, I'd really like to take you on, for example, to give you an impression of what Corona is doing to our population, is to illustrate the first patient actually that I saw today, who was a Somali refugee who could not have been much older than myself and suffers from type 1 diabetes, from a high blood pressure, from kidney failure, but was not actually here to see me for that this morning, but was here to see me because he was actually suffering. He couldn't sleep because of all the itching that he had. And that was as a result of scabies. So this is very typical of what the refugees currently in Moria are having to deal with, a combination of both infectious diseases, but also non-communicable diseases. And having a Corona outbreak in camp would really just topple that balance.
Yeah, we would. I can imagine that the number one priority is to keep everyone safe and not to allow the virus into the camp in the first place. If we can go to Bangladesh now and bring in our friends from Cox's Bazar. Imad, let's start with you. Are you seeing any coronavirus type cases? And what are the biggest challenges for people who are trying their best to keep themselves safe in the camp, in the settlement, when it comes to the coronavirus? Just waiting. Let me just unmute you there. I can't quite hear you. 1 second. Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're seeing is because of the lockdown happened so quickly, and it's been kind of a blanket for everybody, we've seen a lot of resources from the camp, human resources, NGO workers and staffing like that being pulled back. And right now we're only being allowed to provide critical support, which is basically health services, basic, very minimum resources for protection, wash, site management, but basically, and a little bit of distribution, but that is about it, which is causing a lot of issues within the camp because this has happened in a really quick, sudden with the camp. Refugees are like, they're really not sure what's happening.
Do the refugees that you meet every single day, do they understand kind of what's happening? Are they in contact with friends and family who are also fearful?
So that is exactly what we're focusing on. Basically, all the messaging that's coming out is not being contextualized for the camp residents who speak Rohingya Zaban. So only a little bit of them actually understand, are getting these messages, and then they're disseminating. Then we have added on problems where, like right now, internet facilities and access is limited. You don't have the best way of communicating information within the camp of 840,000 people right now is word person to person. But with COVID-19, that's become very, very difficult, and that's a huge challenge that we're facing in the camps.
I can imagine fake news and the dissemination of incorrect information becomes a huge problem. I want to get everyone into the scene now. Just a reminder that we are joined by Filippo Grandi, who's the head of the UN Refugee Agency, Dr. Jamilah Sherally, who is a doctor working in Europe's largest refugee camp on the Greek island of Lesbos. And I want to just bring the conversation through to all of you. What kind of strategic, what should we be doing on a large level strategically to try and help the population? Let me come to you first, Mr. Grandi. The UNHCR has categorized this as a level 2 emergency. So I imagine that means that certain wheels are in motion, hopefully. How are the refugees going to get what they need, the resources they need, the information that they need from the UNHCR and your organization?
Well, there are many big challenges here. We are an organization very used to emergencies, but we have never in our history dealt with an emergency of this type. I was listening to our friends from Cox's Bazar, and they described it very well. The best way to care for refugees is person to person. And now we cannot do it. We cannot do it as much as we would like because of these rules of social distancing, which we must observe because we could be also carrier of the virus and jeopardize their health. So it's a very difficult one. So we are doing a lot of things worldwide, of course, raising funds. We've been fairly successful to raise additional funds so far for this emergency, which we are putting into health measures, water and sanitation, cash for the vulnerables, and also very importantly, back to Cox's Bazar, information campaigns But you know, this is the more traditional way. These things we have done before. How to do them in this context is difficult, needs a lot of creativity. Technology is helping us, but it's a big challenge.
I would like to open the discussion up. Is there any comment or question between us here? And then I'd like to bring in some of the questions that we're getting online. And I want to welcome all of you guys who are watching us on whatever platform you're on. I've got people here from Somalia, Nigeria, the United States, most of Europe. So you're all welcome. But I want to open the discussion to you guys. Do any of you have any question for each other? Imad, is that you?
I have a comment. One of the things that we're facing is because of this, a lot of aid workers now slowly starting being seen as a potential carrier for the virus into the camp settings, which is causing a lot of issues when it comes to misinformation and rumors just spiraling out of control. So the aspect of community engagement at this level is so much more crucial and is going to be the foundation that we are going to need to do to continue this kind of response in the future. I think the old practices might not work anymore.
That's really interesting that this virus is it's going to change the way that aid and resources are distributed. What about you? Is there any similarity that you're seeing on the shores of Europe and in Bangladesh in both refugee camps? Can you see any similarities, Dr. Jamilah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I recognize a lot of what my colleagues in Cox's Bazar are saying. I think the number of healthcare workers, for instance, that are able to come to the island or are here at the moment have decreased substantially. We are holding adjusted hours. We're only able to offer emergency and urgent care. And I really feel that the quality of the care that we're offering at the moment, it was never optimal, but it's even less so at the moment. And this is quite heartbreaking. So I think the effects of COVID, even though we've not had any confirmed cases in the camp of Moria yet, are definitely tangible already.
I completely hear you. As ever at Doha Debates, we try our best to focus on the solutions that may be out there. So I will say this, that the best solution I can offer is to stay in my house in London, to wash my hands regularly. That's about the extent of what I can do. Maybe put on this show for people who are watching. What about you guys? What do you think is the best solution on a macro level, but also personally? Commissioner Grandi, if I might come to you first.
You know, if you there are about 71 million refugees and displaced around the world. Most of them, not all, most of them are fleeing from war, from conflict. You know, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has made an appeal for a global ceasefire. That's the solution. Let's not forget that. Whilst we concentrate on treating scabies or informing refugees, we must do that. Thank God we have people like Jamilah, Imad, and Shafiq that do this. But then let's look also at the bigger picture. The solution for the Somali refugees with scabies is that in his country there's no more war. So if the ceasefire appeal is successful and we are seeing some progress, not much, then we will have made some progress at least towards solution, and the crisis becomes an opportunity. I'm talking very big picture here, I recognize.
What about you, Dr. Jamilah? You got your hand up there like a good participant.
Yes. No, I love how Mr. Grandi is speaking about the global picture. I think on a more regional level, I think what the COVID pandemic has really shown is just the plight of refugees, which has been there for decades already. And it's just highlighting a problem which has existed on Lesbos for the last 5 to 6 years. Here on the ground, really, the only solution that we see is a decongestion of the camp. Like I said, there are 22,000 people living in a camp made for 3,000. And that is definitely something that I feel the EU should take responsibility for. So to have an evacuation of the people here in Moria to curb the effects of a possible outbreak.
Would you, Mr. Grandi, would you agree with that? You raised your hand.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Jamilah very much. We've been really pushing for this decongestion for years. No success. But I don't want to sound too optimistic. this crisis has also unblocked a little bit of that. We've seen the first group of unaccompanied minors moved to European countries the other day. It's only small, it's only a few dozens, but 1,600 are supposed to move out. We have seen a few hundred people moving from the reception center to hotels in the islands, and others, we are told, will be moved to the mainland. Now,
Yes.
this is urgent now. It's not anymore something that can happen in 6 months. It has to happen now because COVID represents an additional risk. But you see, crisis breeds a little bit of opportunity. I'm an optimist,
I like this. I like this, Commissioner. Crisis breeds opportunity. Let's head over to Bangladesh. Shafiq, you as a Rohingya refugee yourself, I know that this is personal to you as much as it is to me. What are you seeing? What can you do to help solve these problems? Are you just going everywhere and telling people to wash their hands? I mean, what can you literally do? You're on the front line there.
So as a Rohingya refugee, what I see that we could help our community to overcome this situation is, since the NGOs are not there and nobody is there to help to the Rohingya refugee, we as a youth, Rohingya youth, are left there. So what we can do is, as long as we have right guidelines and we have trainings to how to tackle how we can raise awareness among our community, because we can we know our community, how we function, how we work, how we behave. So as a youth group, we can solve a lot of problems that's happening inside the camp, because there are right now a lot of rumors going on. People are very scared going to hospital because they heard that whenever you go to hospital with symptoms like cough and fever, then they will give you dangerous injection and you will die. So these kind of rumors are taking place in the camps. And as a youth, as a Rohingya, we can do a lot of things to help our community by ourselves with the right guidelines and right trainings.
I've got a wonderful question here sent in by Mayowa. I don't know where you are, Mayowa. Why don't you tell me in the comments? But Mayowa asks a very good question. Are war-torn countries currently any more peaceful, even if temporarily, as a result of the virus? I wonder if there was a ceasefire declared in Afghanistan, where the Taliban are allowing healthcare workers, are allowing medics to be able to go in and treat populations. I wonder if you guys are hearing anything about more peaceful times. Commissioner Grandi, you mentioned head of the UN talking about peace being the only way forward. Are we seeing any differences? Is humanity learning to be a bit more tolerant because of this virus?
I said I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist. I deal with very, very difficult situations around the world. I would say at least there is an understanding that this is important. And you mentioned Afghanistan. We've seen some talks around the ceasefire proposal. In northern Syria, in spite of a very difficult situation, we've seen at least a holding of the ceasefire that was declared already before the pandemic. In other places like Libya, unfortunately, zero progress. So, it's very uneven. You said a ceasefire has been declared. Unfortunately, a ceasefire has been proposed. The ceasefire has to be declared by the parties to the conflict, by those that are fighting. And some of them are talking, some of them are somehow pausing, some of them are continuing in their bad ways. So it's a mixed picture, but I think there is a little bit of progress, and we need to continue to push on that very important track.
I'd like to ask you another question. You mentioned funding. You mentioned there has been quite a lot of goodwill when it comes to funding, Commissioner Grandi. You've asked for, last month, $222 million more dollars to supplement the 33 you had asked for originally to fight the virus and what's happening within the refugee community. Is that enough? I mean, it seems nowhere near the kind of money we are proposing to give in terms of welfare, in terms of support in the developed world, where billions and billions of money is being distributed. It doesn't seem proportional.
No, but you have to look at this in a broader way. UNHCR, my organization, has been part of a bigger funding appeal issued by the United Nations to respond to the COVID-19 emergency, $2 billion. That you have to look at it comprehensively. Our portion, 250 million, was really for very initial measures, water, sanitation, hygiene, in refugee context. And this whole appeal of 2 billion will be revised in a few days on the 7th of May. Meanwhile, you know, what is very important, the very big and rich institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the development institutions, they're studying ways to really help the affected population. For example, all the people that as a result, as I said earlier, of this pandemic are going to be much poorer. And they are doing, you know, debt relief to countries. They are really injecting huge amounts, which are 10, 20 times bigger. So it's a very big, you know, it's a very complex picture of resources.
I agree with you, but my worry is this, that when you have the President of the United States withdrawing funding to the World Health Organization, another agency within the UN, and almost doing it on a whim, the largest donor to the World Health Organization, is there enough political will to actually get this kind of funding? And if you're going to need more money, then is that going to be possible going forward? I mean, are you finding there to be political will in order to actually help the refugee communities, whether it's moving them along into Europe and getting their cases processed, or giving them money that is needed to make sure that the communities are safe?
I would say this is a complex question. The US WHO issue is not for me to judge. I would only say that WHO at this point is the key organization. They are our leaders in terms of health responses. So I would certainly recommend to all governments to fund them in the first place. They need to be strong and effective. Now, having said this, I think, Nelufar, this initial response was quite good. You know, often when you have a big emergency, the first response is very generous because everybody sees the urgency. I'm a little bit more worried further down the line when the pandemic will go away from the rich countries, because now the pandemic is especially in the rich countries. But what happens when it will move maybe to weaker countries, away from the daily lives of people in donor countries? This is where it will become more challenging. And then, of course, let's not forget that all donor countries' budgets will be focused on dealing with the pandemic in their own countries. So the risk is that another victim, I spoke about the right of asylum, another victim may be humanitarian and development aid. And this we will see only in 1 or 2 years down the line. Very important that everybody who believes in this campaigns with their own governments keep development and humanitarian aid intact, because it will be all the more important in the years to come.
Absolutely. I want to bring in Dr. Jamilah, if I can, at this point. Are you hearing what Mr. Grandi is saying? Do you agree with it? I mean, how would that translate to your work? How will it affect your work in 2 or 3 years' time, when this is no longer a first world problem, but is almost shunned to be dealt with in the third world, in the developing world? How do you think that that's going to affect people?
No, I'm really very happy to hear his response. I think especially the focus on developmental and humanitarian aid, that is very crucial. I think what this COVID pandemic is really teaching us is that at the end of the day, we're all vulnerable as human beings in general, and that it was recently said by the WHO as well, that we're only as strong as our weakest member, and that's definitely the case now. And I very much hope that in 2 years' time we will have a global health system which is more sustainable and which is especially more inclusive, and also includes the more marginalized and vulnerable of society, such as the refugees.
But are you worried that in 2 or 3 years that you're going to have much less resources and many more problems as a result of COVID-19?
Actually, my main concerns are what is waiting for us in the coming weeks and the coming months. I've not really had much time to think about what the coming 2 years will bring. I think we have a very actual threat here at the moment with COVID possibly breaking out in Moria. So that's been my main focus the coming, the last days. I do have a question actually for Mr. Grandi about something he previously said, if you'll permit me. You spoke initially about, I think in the beginning, about the closing, with referral also to the US and closing of the borders, and how a lot of those measures are being taken to protect one's own country and one's own citizens. Our worry here on the ground very much, and which was reiterated actually recently by one of MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, statements, in which we see that the EU might be using COVID as a means to impose certain migration policies. What we see, for instance, also recently in the Mediterranean Sea, where rescue teams are not being able to do their work, or where the ports of Italy and Malta have been closed for new refugees. And here on the ground as well, coming closer to home, for instance, the new arrivals on the island are being quarantined in the north and have been there for over 2 weeks. So my question, I very much realize the importance of closing the borders for one's own people, but have genuine worries about the impact that this will have on the refugees.
You want me to respond?
Yes,
Nelufar?
please, if possible.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamilah. No, actually, we share very much your concern. If you read what we put out very early in this crisis, together with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I issued a statement saying, let these measures be as temporary as possible. Yes. Because otherwise they become a big problem. And you know, even in the middle of a pandemic, we've seen it during Ebola, for example, in West Africa, even in the middle of a pandemic, it is possible for states to manage these influx of refugees in a manner that protects the health of their people, of their communities, by quarantines. You know, we know all these things now because we practice them. So it is possible even to keep the door open in a very controlled and regulated manner and safeguard even more the right of asylum. But the most important is temporariness.
And at this point, I'd love to bring in Imad and Shafiq. Shafiq, I think you guys have a question prepared.
Yeah.
Who's asking it? Go ahead.
Yes, I am. So we have been collecting questions from refugee camps since yesterday. So we have a couple of questions where I am going to ask one of them to Filippo Grandi, sir, which was asked by one of the refugees named Mohammed Ali Johar. And the question is, we Rohingya refugees stay in a small room which is 12 to 15 square feet, as in some families we have 7 to 10 people. So how can we maintain the social distancing while in quarantine?
Mr. Grandi, did you hear that question?
I think I heard. I'm sorry, my sound is a bit broken. It is about social distancing in crowded areas.
That's right.
Of course. Jamilah said the same about Moria. You know, this is why around the world, in the beginning, we singled out a number of situations where the factors were particularly, the situation was exposing refugees or displaced people to especially high risks of contagion in case of outbreak. And crowded spaces was one of the criteria. The reality, we have to be realistic, is that we won't be able to enlarge the space. So we have to work on many other aspects. We have to work on better water supply, hygiene measures, medical facilities. We have to prepare for an outbreak. Thank God we haven't seen any in Cox's Bazar yet, by building quarantine wards and places where people who fall sick may be put in isolation. So we're working on all that, and we're working on, like I said earlier, like Imad and Shafiq mentioned, on information campaign to teach people how to respect these rules even under very adverse circumstances. But we have to be realistic. These situations expose people more than situations where people can keep this 1 meter, 1.5 meters distance from others. And that's a reality that we have to live with.
I'd like to get a question. We've had a question. I can't seem to find it. As soon as my producer does, I'm sure he'll bring it up. There was a really interesting question sent in from Pakistan, Dr. Jamilah, about the effect that this kind of panic and these kind of situations has specifically to do with women and young girls in this situation, especially if they can't be allowed to leave their homes, if they are in the camps and in the settlements. Do you think that there's going to be a specific or a threat to women and young girls who are in the camps, who are being asked to social distance, maybe not go out as often?
Definitely, in general, I think the measures that have been put in place at the moment, such as, for example, the movement restrictions in and out of the camp, but also certain cash systems which have been put in place, that they are definitely affecting the general morale in camp. So we've seen that people are worried, tensions are rising. Like I said, there was a demonstration this morning in camp. Whether this has a specific effect on women and girls in particular, I cannot say. I do not have the statistics for that, but I do know that in general, there's recently we've had higher figures of sexual and gender-based violence. Yes, I do think this is a risk and something that we need to consider when, for example, trying to implement measures such as shielding or isolation wards and whatnot.
Imad, you want to come in on this one, and then
actually, specifically focusing the protection in Kutupalong refugee camp, we know that we're going to see a lot of spikes in protection cases. We're going to have a lot of shortage of protection staff, especially counseling and psychosocial support. So a lot of the resources that the community uses to cope with these kind of situations, and especially this situation right now, that's already been pulled from the camp. So we are expecting a lot of protection issues, especially around women and children, especially gender issues as well. We are really, really fearful. We have 840,000 people in a 2 square mile radius. And if we have cases, there's going to be a complete utter shutdown, which means nobody really can access that camp. And what happens to all the women and children in those kind of scenarios? The other kind of scenario that we are actually been thinking about and trying to figure out solutions for is, what happens if cases come up, everything's strictly shut down? What happens then? What happens to children with families that get infected, that are in isolation units? Right now in Cox's Bazar, in the entire district, we only are planning for about 1,900 beds with a total population with the host community of 1.2 million people.
Oh my goodness.
There's not nearly enough beds. No. When it comes to testing, I mean, it's not something that this situation that we're facing in Cox's Bazar and in the country is something that's happening throughout the region, is where developing countries aren't being able to test. They aren't able to have the resources to do contact tracing. So we are, as a global response to refugees in this scenario, we're really looking at a lot of issues happening in the developing countries where there are going to be lots of resources.
That is an absolutely crucial point. Mr. Grandi, you wanted to get in this, but I want you to comment on what Imad just said about the fact that Bangladesh is a developing nation. That there's not going to be enough testing in PPE to go around as it is, and then to siphon it off specifically to the settlement is going to be even more difficult. How are we going to address these security and safety concerns?
Yeah, I saw that question coming. It's an important one. But if you allow me 2 minutes, back to the question of women, violence and abuse, a very, very important one. Let's also remember, now we're focusing on Greece and Bangladesh. These are camp-like situations. The reality is that, in the world, 70% of refugees and displaced live in communities, do not live in camps. So the problem there at the moment is more one of sliding back into poverty and destitution for these communities.
Yes.
And poverty and destitution are unfortunately equal in many of these places to exploitation of women. Early marriage for very young girls as the only economic outlet for a family, or worse, survival sex and so forth. So this is what we are already observing, and we need to intervene very quickly. There is a health emergency, there is a livelihoods emergency in this pandemic that needs more attention, in my opinion. And then back to your other question, which is very fundamental. One of the biggest challenges that we have is to provide protective equipment because of the reasons that you said. This week, we at UNHCR have been able to mobilize 1.5 million face masks. What is 1.5 million face masks for all our operations around the world? So we're trying to prioritize the most urgent ones. Bangladesh surely will be one, where we need to have more interaction. We and partners and NGOs need to have more interaction with refugees, and this is what we're doing. But it's a huge challenge because simply there are no such things on the market, supply chains are broken, transport is difficult, and there is competition from much wealthier states that can hoard and utilize, and which also need those protective equipment. So again, an unprecedented situation.
Let's bring in everyone here for the final thoughts and final comments before we end the broadcast. I'm grateful to all of you for your time. This is such an important issue, and you're all giving voice to a community that is often voiceless. Let's just go around perhaps and talk about what our hopes are for the immediate future and what we can do to try and tackle this issue. I'd like to start in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, work my way through to Greece, and then maybe Geneva. How about that? Let's do that.
Sure. I think, like, for us here, I think one of the things is that we were saying, is like finding solutions for this issue in a larger scale. I think we have to, as NGOs and development work, aid workers as well, we're going to have to change the way that we work. We have to take into the constraints that we do see funding as going to be a very major issue, because a lot of people will be funding their own state issues, and then funding trickling down will be an issue. We're seeing resources, people being an issue now with the COVID-19. We've already had a lot of humanitarian staff, actually the local, especially local Bangladeshis, their families have asked them to not go to work because of the pandemic. So finding really innovative solutions is something that I think really, really needs to be focused on with all development agencies and NGOs.
And I'm hearing technology and is a good and important way to combat that. Dr. Jamilah.
Yes, thank you, Nelufar. I think I'd like to end on a positive note as well, just like what Dr. Grandi, Mr. Grandi says. I think what has been extremely motivating for me working here the past weeks has been the collaboration between NGOs. I think it's been really very inspiring to see how we're joining forces against the big enemy of COVID. And I think that this is something which is hopefully going to continue into the future. For the people who are watching or listening back at home, we are always needing more staff. So if you are willing to come support our team, you're very welcome. But I think on an individual level as well, just really having, I think awareness is crucial for this vulnerable and marginalized group, signing petitions, pushing your local governments for the evacuation of Moria, for instance. These are very important steps that can help the plight of the refugees.
And Commissioner Grandi, finally to you.
I hope that this crisis that brings us all together in the danger situation, right? We're all facing the same risk here. Also allows everybody to understand that there is no problem in the world, no challenge that concerns only a small number of people. You know how many times before the crisis, when I spoke about refugees, people said, oh yeah, he's right, but it's not my problem. It's far away. It's not far away. COVID has shown that if you don't address this crisis together and everywhere, they come back to haunt all of us. And this is not just epidemics. This is also climate change. This is conflict. This is violations of human rights and discrimination, which caused the 840,000 Rohingya to be in Bangladesh. These are the type of things that concern not only a small group of people, but all of us globally. I hope that when we get out of this, and we will remember this.
Together, everywhere. I love that. The idea of fighting COVID together and everywhere. I would like to thank all of my guests: Filippo Grandi, High Commissioner for Refugees at the United Nations, Dr. Jamilah Sherally, working in Moria refugee camp, and Imad Ahmed and Shafiq Rahman in Cox's Bazar. I'm grateful to you all. Thank you. Wave goodbye to the audience. We're all waving.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for joining me. Now, don't go anywhere. There's just enough time for me to remind you of a few interesting things. If you guys want to head over to the Doha Debates Instagram page, which you should be able to find very easily, we've actually teamed up with an amazing humanitarian organization called Fortified Rights. And we've been following the Rohingya refugee community for over a year before COVID. And now, and we've given 3 Rohingya refugees cameras to document their lives. Some of those images you're seeing right now, what life is like in a camp, what it actually looks like, what the people go through day to day. And it's really fascinating to see. And I'm sure you guys will want to know all the changes are going to come out of COVID-19. So remember to get onto Instagram, go to Doha Debates. You'll be able to find us there. Okay, that's nearly it from our show today. Next Tuesday, we will be back with another one. This time, we will be talking about how the coronavirus is impacting disability communities around the world. If you want to take part in the show, if you want to be one of our audience members that are featured in the show, get in touch with us. It's really easy to do so. We are contact@dohadebates.com. That's wrong. It's actually connect@dohadebates.com. Connect@dohadebates.com. Send us an email. We'll get in touch with you. And hopefully you could be on the show next week. If you are bored, if you've got too much time on your hands, like I do, then you want to head online and get on to Course Correction, the brand new podcast offering from Doha Debates. I'm in it, and I talk to a bunch of incredible people from around the world who are facing some of the world's biggest global challenges and tackling them themselves. You can tune in, you can binge on the 13 episodes that are already there, or log in and find a brand new episode that's going to be dropping tomorrow. That's it from us. That's it from our show. It's lovely to be joined by you, and I'm hopeful that you found this enlightening and interesting. I will find you right here next Tuesday on Dear World Live. See you then.